Hello, my lovely anatomists and physiologists. Our topic for this presentation are the leukocytes, which we can talk about also as white blood cells. And then if we want to, we can abbreviate them as WBCs, which is a nice, easy way of managing these. Now, when we talk about leukocytes, these are our defense, let's use that term instead, defense cells. And so they're defending us from pathogens. They're defending us from DNA mutations. And then they're also like our cleanup crew. And so we're going to see them removing old, damaged, worn out cells. We saw that in the case of the red blood cell already. If there's been tissue damage, then we'll see the leukocytes arriving on the scene in order to help us clean up that debris. When we talk about characteristics of our white blood cells, we'll see they do range in size from 6 to 20 micrometers. So remember with our red blood cells, we said they were like 7 to 8 micrometers. So this is significantly larger. Your white blood cells are living for hours to days with a little bit of an exception. So we'll talk about that. So that's different from our red blood cells that have that precise 120-day sort of lifespan. We'll see that these are less numerous. We already mentioned this in circulation. And why is that? They're less numerous in circulation because they demonstrate a characteristic called either emigration. And notice that's immigration with an E, which is the leaving, not the arriving. Or we can use the term diapedesis. What both of these terms are talking about is that your white blood cells have this ability to squeeze through your capillary and actually leave your capillary. And so what this allows them to do is monitor other areas of your body. So they're in some cases taking up residence in like the dermis of your skin or different other connective tissues across the body. So we'll see these taking up residence in a lot of our different tissues. We'll see them taking residence in our lymphatic organs like our spleen. We've mentioned that already. And we'll see them, kind of present in the lymph fluid. So we'll see them real heavily in the lymphatic system, which makes sense in terms of their job. And then we also see as part of this, they demonstrate what's called positive chemotaxis. So taxis means the movement. Chemo is talking about movement because of a chemical. And the positive means that you move toward. So this is like for me, if I smell like a baking bread or chocolate chip cookies, I move in the direction of those things. And that would be positive chemotaxis. We'll see some of these chemicals that are triggering this movement. We'll see potassium ions. Think about it a minute. Potassium ions should be highest concentration inside of your cell. If you have potassium ions in your body fluids, probably a cell has broken open. If a cell is broken open, there's damage that needs to be cleaned up, plus also potential for pathogen invasion. So that's going to be one of our signals. We'll see a chemical called prostaglandins, which we also interpret as a pain signal. So again, this is an indicator that damage has occurred. So we probably have some cleanup and also potential for pathogens. We mentioned cytokines a little bit already. We just listed them out. And so we'll talk about that more here in this video, as well as in some future videos. When we talk about our white blood cells, we are going to have 5 types. And let's start out by going with our most common. And then we'll move through to our least common. So our most common is called the neutrophil. This is our most common in circulation for sure. When we say most common, this is like 50 to 70% of our white blood cells are going to be neutrophils. These are going to be rapid responders to infection. We see these numbers really elevated when you have a bacterial infection. So they super love to eat up those bacteria. And we'll also see them elevated if you've had some significant burning, burns on your body. You're losing that protective layer of your integument. And so you are at way more risk for bacterial infection. And we'll see that with most of our white blood cells, they are some type of a phagocyte. Phagocyte, remember, means a cell that does phagocytosis, which is that cell eating kind of process. The next one to mention is the lymphocyte. Now, we mentioned already that the lymphocyte, let's put this in a green so it really stands out. The lymphocyte is derived from the lymphoid stem cell, whereas the rest of these are coming from the myeloid stem cell. So this is a significant difference. Also, we've talked about our formed elements as being produced in the red bone marrow, and we'll see with lymphocytes that that's partially true. These are going to be essential to our immune response. These are basically our immune cells. So we are going to talk about them extensively as part of the lymphatic system. We'll see this cell that's called the NK or natural killer cell as an example of a lymphocyte. And they're especially interested in targeting cancer cells, virus infected cells, any of your cells that have atypical markers. The key feature here is these are all your cells that in some way, for some reason, are not behaving normally, right? So it's your cell that's infected with the virus. It's your cell that has become cancerous. It's your cell that has this atypical marker. We also see the B cell as an example of a lymphocyte. And these are going to be described as important in humoral mediated immunity. And what that's going to ultimately mean are antibodies. Now we'll see that the antibody is not being produced directly from the B cell, but B cells are involved. Let's say that B cells are involved, and we'll get into more details as we get into the lymphatic system. So the B cell, the humoral mediated is described. Humoral is talking about the body fluids. So the antibody is released into the body fluids. And then we have also what's called a T cell here, which you may have heard of these before. T cells are described as part of our cell mediated immunity. And what this is really talking about is cell to cell combat. So T cells seek out pathogens and actively kill them. T cells seek out your infected cells and actively kill them. T cells and B cells basically work together to help protect you from pathogens. And what we'll see as part of our response with these two cell types is we get what are called memory cells. This is our immunity that we develop in response to exposure to pathogen, whether that exposure is we're exposed and we get sick and we develop immunity and memory, or through modern medicine, we get a vaccine. And so that allows us to develop immunity and memory without any of the risks associated with having the infection. And these memory cells will live for years. So up there at the top, we talked about, oh, these white blood cells are living for hours to days. And we also talked in the endocrine about the thymus as where T cells mature, and the thymus kind of becomes less active with age. But what we see is our memory cells live for years. So even though we're not producing a lot of new T cells, we have those memory cells from all of our childhood exposures. When we were talking about abundance, the lymphocyte is about 20 to 30% of our white blood cells. Okay, the next one for us to look at is what's called the monocyte. The monocyte. And so the thing here I want to say is that this is going to produce the macrophage. And I'm going to go ahead and draw again my Pac-Man with teeth, macrophage, because this is a super important phagocytic cell. We see that these are living in the spleen, living in the liver, living in the bone marrow, but then also strategically located throughout the body. So these are going to be one of our important phagocytic cells of the body. And the monocyte we see is at a percentage of like 2 to 8% of the white blood cells. And these percentages should be based on the circulation levels. And then the next one to mention is the eosinophil. Now the eosinophil, neutrophil, and this next one we'll talk about basophil are all named based on what kind of staining techniques work for them. So we won't really get into that a whole lot, but it is listed for us in our text if you're interested. These are of an abundance of about 2 to 4%, and we'll see that these produce what's called antihistamine, which you've maybe taken before when you have an allergy. Antihistamine is an anti-inflammatory. So you take it when you have an allergy response in order to reduce that response. We see that eosinophils also make toxins for parasitic worms. And we see them acting as phagocytes for antibody antigen complexes, meaning you've already produced the antibody is binding to that particular pathogen, and then the eosinophil super likes that and can phagocytize that pretty easily. And so that is also kind of a connection in with this allergy piece. So we'll see that when we have allergy response, very often we've produced an antibody against the allergen, even though the allergen is not actually dangerous and a pathogen for us. Our immune system doesn't realize that. So we will see eosinophil levels elevated when we're suffering from an allergy, or if we have a parasitic worm. I don't know if we should say an infection or infestation for that. And we can also see this elevated in an autoimmune kind of disorder, where autoimmune is talking about your immune system is attacking your cells, even when it shouldn't. It's basically treating your body like a pathogen. And the last one of these to mention is the basophils. So again, eosinophils, neutrophils, and basophils are named based on how they stain. And this one is the least abundant. We see less than 1% in circulation here. And this one is going to release histamine, which is actually going to increase inflammation. So antihistamine is working against histamine. Inflammation, we'll see is an important defense mechanism. So we'll talk about that. We also see it producing heparin, which is going to oppose blood clotting. So let's highlight this chemical as well that we're producing. And then the last thing is we'll see this one also elevated when we have allergy. We can see it elevated with parasites. And we can see it elevated also with hyperthyroidism, or excuse me, hypo. Okay. Last thing to mention here, and I know we've talked for quite a while, are those cytokines. So when we talk about cytokines, we're basically talking about autocrine factors. Remember autocrine factors? Autocrine communication is like talking to yourself. Or we have paracrine factors. So if autocrine is talking to yourself, paracrine is just talking to your neighborhood, right? So we can talk about both of these if we want to as like local hormones, meaning they're not transported through the bloodstream, they're not widespread communication throughout the body. And we have two important categories to talk about here. We have what's called the interleukin. And then we also have what's called the colony stimulating factor, which can be abbreviated as CSF. So the interleukin we're going to see is going to be released to increase white blood cell production. It's going to increase immunity, and it's going to increase inflammation. It's going to trigger those basophils to make that histamine, which is going to cause inflammation. The colony stimulating factor we'll see also just increases white blood cell production. And so that's going to be really those neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. So if autocrine and paracrine factors, and that means we're getting these released, right there at the location of the damage or the infection that's occurred. And we can real quickly remind ourselves of what we talked about. Remember back when we talked about hemopoiesis and we talked about the white blood cell production coming from those myeloid stem cells. And we mentioned at that point the cytokine as an important chemical that will help to trigger that differentiation into the neutrophil, the basophil, eosinophil, and the macrophage. Okay. So up next, we have the platelet. So stay tuned. As always, take care of yourselves and each other.